Today is a very, very, very special episode with my good friend Nick Zararis. It is the Big Ten preview episode number 2 of this series. Make sure to go back and watch the ACC preview with Corby if you haven't already. Enjoy. All right, I'd now like to welcome on a very special guest. It is my Gotham SN co-worker, Nick Zararis, here to talk some Big Ten. It is a big year in the Big Ten, coming off a year where they had 2 teams in the college football playoff. They have potential to do something like that again this year. And then after this year, the Big Ten's going to get even more interesting, which we can get to at some point if we have time. But right now, we were just talking before we started recording. We're both extremely excited to talk college football, start getting into some of this stuff. So we definitely want to start with this season. But how are you doing? How ready are you to get into all this?
I was scrolling through TikTok this morning while I was eating breakfast, and I had a shittily put together edit set to the Fall Out Boy song Centuries, and I was ready to strap a helmet on. That's how.
Oh yeah.
It took all of 45 seconds of a TikTok to be like, yeah, I need football badly.
Just one college game day song to come on to.
All I need.
Yeah. And you went with an LSU hat even for Big Ten Day, just because of SEC supremacy.
It just matters more, Blake.
Yeah. Well, you're a Penn State guy, which is part of the reason I wanted to have you on, other than that we always have a good time talking football, because I think they're really, really intriguing team. Obviously, Ohio State and Michigan are top of the odds board right now. Ohio State is just ahead of Michigan, plus 170. Ohio State, Michigan plus 180 to win the conference. But if you look at different books, it could flip either way. They're pretty much neck and neck. Michigan actually has a little bit more security, I would say, coming into the season. JJ McCarthy is by far the most experienced quarterback in the conference, let alone at the top of the. Whatever you think about him, which I think you can make arguments for and against him. I've made arguments against him in the past, but at this point, he is the most experienced quarterback in the conference, whereas Ohio State, even though you hear all this stuff about Kyle McCord and how he's going to be unbelievable, better than CJ Stroud and better than Justin Fields and all these other guys they've had, you never know until they play real games. Penn State kind of in the same boat with Drew Aller, who is supposed to just be like a sensation. And we saw glimpses of him. He got on the field a bit last year, but still pretty unproven, totally different being a QB1. So let's kind of start with those 3 teams. They're kind of always at the top of the Big Ten East. There is a bit of a gap to Penn State. They're 6-1 to win the conference, but still the 3rd best, still better odds than anybody from the West, despite them having to beat Ohio State and Michigan. So just from a Penn State perspective, where do you kind of see yourself falling in going into this year?
Like you said, they're very interesting. They're very high variance. That would be the way I would describe Penn State year over year, is extremely high variance. There's a world in which they lose one game this year and they lose the right game. That's the biggest issue for whoever you are in the Big Ten East. You can lose one game and still get in, but do you lose the right game in the food chain? That's what happened the year Penn State went to the Rose Bowl and lost to USC. If they had won the right game in their one-loss season, they arguably should have made the college football playoff as the Big Ten champion with one conference loss and one non-conference loss. There's a real argument they should have made it that year, and you saw it this past year where both got in. It happens in the SEC every now and then where you can get 2 teams in. If you have the right loss, you can survive. It's just the East is so brutal, and Penn State always plays themselves down to their opponents, especially against some of the bad teams. Everybody remembers the 9 overtime game against Illinois. They always let teams that aren't that good hang around for a while, and that's where they get into trouble in those games. And then in the big games, they play well enough to hang around, and then a crucial decision comes. And no matter what it is, James Franklin always picks the wrong side of the coin. You and I talked about this last year going into the Penn State-Ohio State game, where I was like, he always makes the wrong decision. And you were like, but he likes to be aggressive in these kinds of games. And I'm like, yeah, but he goes for a 4th and 7 on his own 43 in the first quarter. That's not help it. That's the wrong type of being aggressive. And that's kind of the issue Penn State's had to get to close the gap, because talent wise, they're definitely the next tier down from Ohio State and Michigan, but they're not that far behind. They should not be 6-1 on talent in terms of why they're so far behind Ohio State and Michigan.
Yeah, and so you brought him up. It is kind of a fitting year. It is year 10 for James Franklin. It will be a full decade at the end of the season. And you mentioned kind of his best season ever. He's never been to the college football playoff. He was defeated by Sam Darnold in the Rose Bowl, famously. Sam Darnold played the best football game he's ever played in his life that day. And it is a weird thing as a fan of an SEC East team where Georgia's just been so dominant. You kind of have to and there is excitement. Not that we're not going to get into the SEC, even though I already did this, but just to make a parallel, it is kind of an exciting year for South Carolina going into this year. And people talk to me about oh, how pumped are you? And it's I am excited because it should be a more fun product to watch than I've gotten to watch the last few years. But when there's that team above you, that when you just look at them, you're I know I'm not better than that team. So for me to have a successful season, what is the measure of a successful season? And in college football, it's hard, especially when only 4 teams make the playoff, to kind of measure what is a successful season. Because like you said, you could even go 11-1 and Ohio State or Michigan goes undefeated. And however the playoff falls, you aren't playing for your conference championship and you don't make it into the top 4. And it's well, you win 11-1. The only team you lost to is one of the best teams in the country. But is that a successful season? And that's kind of what people have been doing with James Franklin is whole tenure at Penn State. It's been he's had a good season like that where he makes the Rose Bowl and
they won the Rose Bowl
Ohio
last
State.
year.
Yeah.
They beat Utah. That's a solid season. Considering the 2 teams ahead of you made the playoff, arguably they probably both should have made the national title game. I mean, Michigan really laid an egg against TCU, and Ohio State's a field goal away from playing for it. There's no shame in being the 3rd best amongst that group last year. This year, considering Ohio State is kind of in a weird spot right now where it's very weird to me. Every day I log on Twitter and I see people complaining about Ryan Day because the bar has been elevated, because Michigan has finally kind of gotten to where they've supposed to be in the last couple of years, and they've really kind of elevated what they are. And I still don't know how long Michigan can sustain what they've done the last 2 years, because they're aging out guys and they're recruiting better than they had the previous couple cycles. But the last 2 years, Michigan has kind of done it with running the ball, being physical, controlling the line of scrimmage. And I just don't know how viable that is to kind of try and win a national title with the game manager quarterback unless you have a generational team like Georgia. Georgia's the exception to that rule. Stetson Bennett is a solid game manager. He got the MVPs for the playoff games this year, whatever, that's cute. He was only doing that because the team around him was incredible. There are not a lot of teams that are going to be able to surround a game manager quarterback with that level of talent. Maybe JJ McCarthy has another level of dynamic ability that we've yet to see because he hasn't really gotten comfortable yet. But I don't think Michigan is as on firm ground as everyone wants them to be, just because they've played Ohio State well. Playing Ohio State well, that's good for Michigan as a school. But in terms of national perspective, I struggle to see Michigan measuring up well against some of the schools they would play against in the playoff. Again, they've come up short both times they've been in the playoff. I mean, that Georgia team, I don't think anyone was beating that Georgia team that year, and no one did beat the Georgia team that year. So that's the counterpoint to that. But Penn State's in a weird spot because they historically are the 3rd best team in the Big Ten. I mean, you could argue Wisconsin because they won all the Big Ten Wests, but didn't actually do anything when they got there. But Penn State's got the Rose Bowl. They've won the Big Ten, which Wisconsin hasn't done in this alignment. So that's really all you can say. They're the 3rd best team for sure, but closing the gap, it's more than just talent, because the talent gap isn't huge.
Yeah, which now maybe doesn't seem like as big of a deal, but in the grand scheme of things, they're closer to Michigan, Ohio State than they are to the rest of the pack, except maybe Wisconsin. I think those are the 4 teams that have the potential to win the conference. Wisconsin is a pretty big favorite this year to win the West, and we can talk about them in a few. But those are the 4 teams that can win, and nobody else really has a chance. If somebody else scrapes out the West, they would get destroyed by Michigan or Ohio State or even Penn State. So they have kind of gotten ahead of Michigan State and Nebraska and Iowa, some of these programs that they were probably level with for a while. They now are a better program, which is a big accomplishment. And again, it's hard when you have those 2 teams ahead of you all the time. But at a certain point, like we said, this is going to be a full decade of James Franklin at the end of the year. When is it being the 3rd best? When is that like enough? Or no, when is it no longer enough? And I think for it to be a successful season for Penn State, if I was to lay out what I would consider success, I think you have to beat one of Michigan or Ohio State. And I think you have to not have any stupid Penn State losses. And if you finish the season 11-1 with a loss to either Michigan or Ohio State, and even if you don't make the Big Ten championship game because that other team went undefeated or however the tiebreakers work out, you don't make it,
you can live with that.
You can live with it, and maybe you do make it into the college football playoff the same way Ohio State did last year, as one loss to Michigan if Michigan goes 12-0. And so I think that's really what you have to root for. And Michigan is a home game, and I think at the end of the day, they will be a more beatable team, especially for Penn State. So I think that's really the game you got to look at. They play at Ohio State October 21st, so kind of right in the middle of the season. So if you can get to that point undefeated, they have a pretty weak non-conference schedule.
They got UMass coming in this year, which is hysterical.
Yeah, West Virginia, Delaware, and UMass. That should be 3 wins. And then they have Illinois, Iowa at home, and Northwestern at the beginning of the season. So those are their games before Ohio State. So they'd have to do something pretty catastrophic to not be undefeated up to that point. And then maybe you lose to Ohio. If they can pull off that win, then all of a sudden they have all the momentum and they control their destiny to the championship game in the playoff. But even if they lose, it's got to be a bounce back to win out the rest of the way, beat Michigan, and just hope things kind of fall your way. So I think that's kind of where Penn State has to be from that perspective. But talking about Wisconsin, you kind of brought them up. It's an interesting year for them, obviously. Huge hire with Luck Fickell. I think it's a really good hire. I think he's a great coach and would have been successful at any big program, but I think he's a really good fit for Wisconsin. I think that kind of brand of football, playing hard-nosed defense, run the football, is kind of what he wants to do. It's how he was successful at Cincinnati, was obviously this guy right here behind me. And their defense was unbelievable. And even Desmond Ridder, the type of quarterback he was just kind of like a grinder, physical type quarterback. So I think he's going to fit in really well there. I think Wisconsin fans are going to respond to him really well, which is important because I think there was a lot of them wanted Jim Leonard to become the full-time head coach. But then at the end of the day, I think Luck Fickell is a better football coach. So I think they kind of went for it, and hopefully for them, it ends up being the right move. And then the other big move they made was bringing in Tanner Mordecai, who was the quarterback at SMU for the last few years and has just put up insane numbers, obviously against a different level of talent, but he's going to be the most talented Wisconsin quarterback in years. I couldn't even tell you since who in a long time. So if he can actually bring some kind of offense, I think they should cruise through the Big Ten West. I think their only competition really is Iowa, just because it's just so annoying to play Iowa and they just kind of always end up there. But I really hate that Iowa team. I think they're just going to be kind of a worse version of what they were last year, which was pretty pathetic. So I think when you're looking at, if you want to bet somebody to win the conference, realistically, it's 4 teams. And I personally don't think betting Ohio State or Michigan is worth it at
No,
the odds they're at. If you really like one of those teams, you literally wait until the last game of the season and bet a bunch of money on Ohio State or Michigan,
just
and
to win
you're
the game. Yeah.
yeah, to beat each other head to head, and there's a good chance that will determine who makes the conference championship game. Obviously, Penn State, we're saying, could have something to say about that, but there's a good chance that that game will determine who makes the conference championship game. So I think you really either have to go, if you believe in Penn State, which I do, I think you could go there, or if you believe in Wisconsin, they're at plus 650, so just behind Penn State. I think both of those would not be bad numbers to look at. I think they're the only two teams I would consider betting if you wanted to bet somebody to win the conference. Do you have any more thoughts about Wisconsin other than what I
It's
said?
really interesting that they brought in an air raid quarterback to a Wisconsin program, which is, historically not a lot of pass attempts. They've churned out a million running backs into the NFL. They've historically produced really good offensive linemen, but they haven't ever really put a great quarterback into the league other than Russ. And, Russ was a transfer. That was probably the last great Wisconsin quarterback. So to bring in somebody who comes from the SMU air raid offense where it's throwing it 55, 60 times a game, that's really interesting. That's a real contrast. And I think this is something we can talk about to bring the conversation back to Penn State is that's been the bar for a lot of these second tier teams, the Penn States, Michigan, Wisconsin, that next tier of team that hasn't made the playoff that consistently yet in comparison to the Alabamas, Ohio States, Oklahomas, what have you. Those schools that consistently make the playoff, they have the best quarterback prospects. They have the really good, talented guys that are blue chips on paper and they play like it. You think about some of the issues Penn State's had over the years, and they're similar to what Wisconsin's had. They've got the gamey, scrappy quarterback who gets the shit knocked out of them, that get back up, that put their head down and initiate contact. But Sean Clifford, he's not dotting you up underneath. Trace McSorley's the best quarterback in the history of the program, and he wasn't that efficient of a passer. He was like a 58, 59% completion guy. So that's really why I think Penn State this year in particular interesting. You have the blue chip quarterback. It's just a matter of, do you finally have the right marriage of quarterback and scheme? Is your quarterback's talent going to fit what you want to do? That's the other issue. That's kind of the thing I wonder about Wisconsin with Tanner Mordecai. I've known that name since he was in high school because I remember he's got a unique name, but I remember being like, okay, this is going to be one of the guys to keep an eye on. And SMU always puts up decent numbers. They're always relatively interesting to watch. They're fun to bet. But Wisconsin plays such a different brand of football. And it's the same thing in regards to Drew Aller at Penn State. Are they going to let him sling it? Or are they going to do the training wheels offense they had to do with Sean Clifford the last few years because of his limitations? Is James Franklin willing to put some chips on the table and take some risks? Because historically he hasn't. And when he has, he's done it in situations where it doesn't make sense to.
Yeah, and to just add one more thing about Wisconsin, they did bring in Phil Longo as their offensive coordinator, which I think was an unreal hire. Obviously, Luke Fickell is kind of more of a defensive guy, so to bring in a creative offensive mind, Phil Longo was in the Lane Kiffin coaching tree for a while, and then was the OC at North Carolina the last couple of years, and kind of is the one that kind of took that offense to the next level the last couple of years with what Drake May has done, and even before that what they were doing. So I think if everything clicks, Wisconsin could be
Easy in
really
the West.
good. They should dominate the West, and then it comes down to one game against one of those teams. And you got to think they'll just get better as the year goes on, as they get more comfortable and gel more. And it's just, I usually don't like picking a team with a first year head coach to win a conference or exceed expectations, because usually things just, it's so hard in college football for everything to click right away. But in any situation where it would, I think Wisconsin kind of has it. And one more thing about Penn State, they did bring in one of the most electric transfers in all of college football. They kind of loaded up on, tried to get some talent to go around their new quarterback. They got Dante Cephas, who was at Kent State. The Kent State Flashes were one of the most exciting offenses in all of college football to watch last year. Midweek action, he put up insane numbers, and that was with a Mac offense and Mac quarterback throwing to him. So I think they could have, and with Nick Singleton, I think they could have offensive firepower. Kind of like you said, it's kind of what are the coaches going to let them do? I think if maybe because they have such an easy early start to the season, maybe you can get away with being conservative the first couple of weeks and easing him into the playbook. But I think by the time like that Ohio State game is coming around, like you're talking about, if they're still kind of tentative and not just being like, we just got to go for it and be aggressive, then I think they could regret that. But that's kind of the big picture with the conference. I think the one other interesting thing I touched on at the very beginning is it is a crazy year for quarterback turnover in the conference. Like I said, JJ McCarthy is by far the most experienced. The second most experienced quarterback is Taulia Tagovailoa at Maryland, who I love him. I get like addicted to him.
He's fun.
And because he'll have one game where you're like, oh, this is Tua. He's being Tua right now.
Yeah.
And you're like, this is awesome. And then you'll bet on them the next week and they literally don't score. They'll lose like 35-0 to like Purdue. And you're like, how did this happen? And it's really frustrating, but he's the second most experienced quarterback. And then if you go down to number 3 of, this is returning quarterbacks, non-transfers, the third most experienced quarterback in the conference is Athan Kaliakmanis, who was the backup to Tanner Morgan at Minnesota. He has the third most experience of any Big Ten quarterback, and he has only gotten time when Tanner Morgan has been injured. So that's really how up in the air it is of guys coming back. Obviously, Graham Mertz transferred out of Wisconsin. CJ Stroud is gone, obviously. A couple other guys transferred out of the conference. And so it's really going to be Aiden O'Connell out at Purdue, who's been there for a decade. And like all these guys, it's kind of been a big turnover. So I think it could be a really interesting year. So I'm just going to kind of go down team by team and say their win total. And we can both just kind of give a over, under, pass if it's anything that seems interesting. First one's Michigan, 10.5 wins. I think it's about right. I think they probably win 11 games. I think they probably lose 1 to Ohio State or Penn State, but I would just pass on it.
I feel good about that number. I would take the over on that number. I think they hit that number.
I think 11's more likely than 10 for sure.
Yeah.
So if you can find a good number with good juice. Ohio State also at 10.5. Again, I think if kind of where I was looking with Michigan and Ohio State, if you like one of those teams, maybe give yourself more time, watch them the entire season. And if you think they're going to win over 10.5 games, maybe just wait and bet on them against Michigan.
Yeah.
Because it's probably that's going to be what decides it. So,
and you'll get a better number, frankly. That's what matters.
Yeah. So then Penn State is 9.5. And so I think this is actually interesting. I think I actually like this over on their win total more than I like them to win the conference, because I think they could easily win 10 or 11 games and not win the conference.
For sure.
Not even be able to play for the conference. Like we said, they have a really easy out of conference schedule. They have an easy start to the season. So with a young quarterback getting adjusted, he's going to have a much easier footing. And then kind of some of the tougher games like Maryland and Michigan State, like not even counting the Michigan-Ohio State game, are all later in the season. So I think that does really well for them. And I really think that they won't lose to anybody that's not Michigan or Ohio State. So even if they lose to both, that's over 9.5. So I'm going to be betting that win total over 9.5.
I'm going to echo everything you just said. You're exactly right. A repeat of what happened last year. They can entirely do exactly what happened last year. And their non-conference is a little bit easier this year. They don't have to go to Auburn. They have the one hard at non-conference game is West Virginia, who's not that good. And West Virginia's going to Penn State. So you don't feel bad about the non-conference. The only conference game that really worries you is Michigan State, because Penn State never plays Michigan State that well, even though they are always more talented. That goes way back. That's a long-term thing. I mean, we were talking about before, the reason they didn't make the college football playoff the year they won the Big Ten was they lost to Michigan State. That was their undoing that year. So I think there's not really a world where they don't win at least 10 games because the schedule is too easy this year. It really lines up well for them to really pounce and take advantage and be opportunistic here.
Yeah. So then we kind of get into the Wisconsin is at 9, and so they're kind of the opposite of Penn State when I look at those two teams. I think if you like Penn State, bet their win total over, and then maybe bet them individually in their games against Ohio State and Michigan, and then see what happens, or even bet them to win the college football playoff at a bigger long shot, because they are maybe in a spot where they have a better chance of making the playoff than they do of winning the Big Ten, falling into a situation like Ohio State did last year and like some SEC teams have. But I think Wisconsin's the opposite. I think if you like Wisconsin, I think they could win 8 or 9 games and then somehow win the Big Ten championship. Whereas like they could win 8 games and win the West. They could definitely win 9 games and push that win total and win the West. So I think if you like them, just bet them to win the conference at plus 650. Whereas if you like Penn State, do the opposite, bet their win total over instead of the conference.
Yeah, the numbers make more sense to do it that way, strategy wise. Yeah, that's really what it comes down to when you're looking at any of these long-term futures. It's always about the number. You can usually get better value when you're strategic, like you were saying, in regards to betting Ohio State or Michigan week to week, if you prefer that, and then loading all the way up like you would have if you were to bet a future. Same thing here with Wisconsin. They don't have a particularly difficult non-conference. The West, the only issue you worry about with the West, any of the teams, is that some of those games just turn into rock fights. You get into the deep end with Iowa, and it's 9-6 in the fourth quarter, and you have 157 yards of offense, and you wondering what the hell just happened. We've played almost an entire game, and we've crossed midfield twice, and that's really the only peril of betting some of these teams in the West. Is this going to be the year Minnesota decides to be frisky again? We know Minnesota is capable of that every now and then. That's what the only real concern about the West, because talent-wise and coaching-wise, Wisconsin are clearly the best in the Western Division.
Yeah, so that kind of lends to my point of what I was going to get to. After these top 4 teams that have win totals of 9 or better, you get into where almost the whole conference is between 5.5 and 7.5 wins, because all these teams are going to be -3, -4 pick'ems against each other, back and forth, trading blows. And that goes from Iowa at 7.5. Maryland at 7, Illinois and Minnesota at 6.5, Nebraska at 6, Michigan State 5.5, Purdue 5.5. All these teams kind of run together. So Iowa, I'm going to pass on. The only team out of this group that I am going to bet the win total over, and we just talked about it, and I'm such a sucker. I already know how it's going to go. I'm going to be betting Maryland over 7 wins. I really like this team. Like I said, they have the second most experienced quarterback in the conference. I think he is capable on any given day of outscoring whoever their opponent is. I think they have a pretty favorable schedule. Sorry, I'm pulling up the schedule right now. They have a pretty bad out of conference. They played Towson, Charlotte, and at home against UVA the first 3 weeks. So that should be 3 wins. And then they have Michigan State, Indiana, Ohio State, Illinois, Northwestern, Penn State, Nebraska, Michigan, Rutgers. So if you give them 3 losses against Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State, which having Penn State and Michigan at home, I think there's a chance they could win one of those 2 games. But even if you take that away, that's 9 other games, and I think like 6 of them are solid wins. Towson, Charlotte, Virginia, Indiana at home, Northwestern, and Rutgers. I think those are 6 wins. And then the leftover games would be at home against Illinois, at Nebraska, and at Michigan State. And they would have to win one of those 3 to push the win total, and 2 of those 3 to go over the win total. So I'm doing it. I'm falling for the Maryland football trick like I do every year, but that's what I'm doing.
Was it last year or 2 years ago that Maryland was like 12th in the country? They were like 6-0, and they played Iowa on a Friday night, and then Iowa came in and just beat the shit out of them over the course of 4 quarters.
Yeah, that was 2 years ago, I believe.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, and that's what you're going to get.
Yeah.
And I know they might win one of those games, like I said, Penn State or Michigan at home, but then they're going to lose on a away to Rutgers the last game of the season for me to like push the win total or something. And I'm ready for that, but you have to believe in something once in a while.
Yeah, that's part of the fun of the future, is you get to ride it out every single week with one of these teams.
Yeah. So is there anybody from kind of the rest of that middle group that you would touch any of those win totals, or do you kind of agree that they're all just going to beat each other up, and you really can't predict who's going to have 7 wins versus 6 wins versus 5 wins?
Somebody has to be the second best team in the West. That's really the only place I would say, if you feel strongly about one of those teams that's in that 6.5 range, that's the only real if you feel particularly good about one of those teams, not like you and I, Blake, where we're both kind of in the same boat, where we feel Minnesota, Illinois, Iowa, that tier of team, they're all going to beat each other up, and whoever's the last team standing, whatever. If you feel particularly good about Cade McNamara at Iowa, if you feel particularly good about what Illinois or what Minnesota is looking like, then go for it, by all means. But because someone has to finish in second place in the West. Someone has to. I mean, we were looking at it last year where there was a mathematical way for Iowa to still win the West going into the last week of the season, how bad of a division it was last year.
Yeah. And so the only other team that I will mention that we can talk about for like an extra minute, just because they're a little more interesting, is Nebraska. Obviously, one of the splashier hires of the offseason with Matt Rule coming there. And to be honest, I like the hire for Nebraska. I don't know if Nebraska football, if it's ever going to work out, it just might not work out. But I do think Matt Rule is a very good college football coach. And I'm not saying in 5 years they'll be playing for national championships, but I think within 5 years, they could be competing for the Big Ten West with Wisconsin.
Yeah.
They could be whatever the Big Ten will be in 5 years. I think they could be a team that will have a year that it clicks and they'll be in contention. They'll be a top 25 team. So I do like the hire. But one interesting thing I saw with Matt Rule teams, and I should have written it down because I don't have it off the top of my head, but his first year at Temple, I think he won 2 games and then won 10 games in year 2 and kind of took off. And then the same thing happened at Baylor, where he came into a shit show at Baylor and he won, I think it's the same, maybe 2 or 3 games. And everybody's like, what the hell? And then the next year again, wins 10 games, 11 games. And all of a sudden that program takes off. So I think this is a situation where he's not going to feel any pressure to be like, oh, I got to go win 8 games this year to prove that. I think he's very aware that this is going to be a long-term thing. The school knows it's going to be a long-term thing. So I wouldn't bet their win total, but they're a team that I'm going to look at the first half of the season. And if you can see they're kind of starting to get things together, then maybe second half of the season, they're a team I would maybe like to bet week to week, because I do think he could maybe get something going towards the end of the first season.
That's a good way to think of it, because they're going to have so much roster turnover. Nebraska was having a ton of roster turnover under Scott Frost, frankly, where guys were leaving after a year or two. So he's got to mold that team into kind of what he wants it to look like. He's got to recruit his own guys and get a full cycle, because he got hired relatively late in the hiring process, where, usually it takes a little while to get going, but the fact they hired him a little after teams had already been teams had fired guys and started getting it together. It's complicated. I see an argument for what you're saying, that if they can build a little momentum as the season goes along, start to feel good about themselves, they can win a game that they probably have no business winning. I can see a world in which that happens for sure. At the very least, they'll be relevant. And that's what Nebraska's been craving for a while now, is get into one of these big games, play well. The last time they did that was when they played Oklahoma a couple years ago, and they kept it within a touchdown the entire game and messed up everybody's several leg parlay where they had Oklahoma by 9.5 and Nebraska kept it within 7 the entire game. That's the last time Nebraska played well in a big game. They had Ohio State come out there, game day was there, and Ohio State beat them like 53-7. All Nebraska wants to do is be competitive against the good teams this year.
Yeah, so I just looked at Nebraska's schedule. There are 2 games I'm circling, physically and mentally circling, to come back to. One, this is going to be what I'm doing every week, especially early in the season. Week 2 against Colorado.
Oh, yeah.
I think Matt Rule could just run circles around Coach Prime. I don't want to – what am I – Coach? I have to call him Coach. Otherwise, he'll track me down and reprimand me, tell me I've been bad. But I am so.
I think Colorado is good. They have no roster talent.
Yeah.
It's great he brought 30 guys with him. You need 100 guys to run a successful college football program. It takes so long to turn over a roster, and I understand why the networks and why game day are excited. He's good content.
Yeah, it's cool. It's a cool story for sure, and it's not to say that he will never be successful at big time college football. It's just people that think that team is going to be good this year is just insane. So that game, and then the last game of the season, they play Iowa, and if they're sitting at 5 wins and can head to a bowl game with a win against Iowa, I think I could see them going in and just steamrolling a lifeless Iowa team. So those are 2 games I'm going to look at with Nebraska. And then, so the last thing, we went through all those kind of middle teams. There's 3 teams that are kind of more towards the bottom. Rutgers at 4.5. See how much longer the Schiano experiment can survive. It hasn't gone probably as well as they'd hoped so far. Not that, I don't know. I don't know if anybody could really get that program past where it is now, but 4.5 wins. I'm staying away from Rutgers. But there is one more win total I'm betting, and that's Indiana under 3.5 wins. I just think this team is really bad. They really have nobody. It's Tom Allen, I think, has been living for a long time off of
the pandemic season.
One successful season that wasn't even real. And I got my sweatshirt on, my favorite quarterback in college football. Everybody knows I'm a Penix guy, and he's given Tom Allen a career basically. And again, not to bring up bad Penn State memories, partially based on a game that they shouldn't have won. Like all this stuff, he's kind of been living off of this. They're now at 3.5 wins as their win total is so pathetic. For some reason, they got scheduled that they have to play Ohio State the first game of the year. So they're going to get stomped, and I think it will just take the life out of this team. They have 2 gimme games, non-conference, Indiana State and Akron. I think it's entirely possible those are the only 2 games they win. Their third non-conference game is against Louisville at a neutral site. I think they could easily lose that game. Some of their more winnable games like Illinois, Purdue, Maryland, they have to go on the road for all those games. At home against Rutgers is really their only conference game that they will probably be favored in. So I think Indiana State, Akron, Rutgers, those are the only 3 games they'll even have a chance to win. And if Rutgers beats them, I wouldn't be surprised at all. So I think under 3.5 wins for Indiana is my other win total bet.
Yeah, you make a compelling case. And when was the last time you saw an Indiana highlight? I'm not even saying win the game, just like a pick 6, a fumble 6, a long touchdown. It's been a minute. It has been a long minute since I've seen anything Indiana football on the timeline. That's generally the gauge of like if I need to pay attention to a team or not. You don't even need to be that good. Do you have one player who can make splashy plays on either side of the ball? Are you going to have one guy who's going to not tolerate a sliding season, who's going to say, we're not doing that shit. I don't care. I'm too good for this. That's going to find ways to salvage a game. I don't think Indiana has one of those guys. I entirely see your point.
Yeah, they're going to be starting a freshman quarterback. They don't even know which freshman quarterback
Yeah.
yet. They have a couple that they're still deciding between, which to me, that means neither one of them is impressed that much.
Yep.
So I think it's going to be a disaster. And then the very last team on the list, they currently don't have a win total. Books have taken them down for obvious reasons, is Northwestern. We don't need to get too deep into this because it's, I don't know, it's a weird situation at the moment. Obviously, Fitz has been fired. All happened pretty fast from this initial story coming out about hazing allegations, and then another player saying that there was a culture of racism and hazing and all this stuff. And I feel like some people were surprised thinking that he was one of the more untouchable coaches. I kind of was reading that, and I get the perspective of why people think that, because they were a program that didn't matter at all. And then he came along and built a couple of winning teams, went to a Big Ten championship game, kind of turned them into at least a team that people know who they are.
He got them a lot of funding. That's the biggest thing. He got them
Yeah.
the practice facility. He got the commitment, which has since been reneged on a new football stadium. But even though they weren't that good, he had people who in that community willing to spend money on football, which they hadn't before.
Yeah. And so I think it's an interesting situation. And I think, just from my perspective, this is not based on any actual anything that I know, but I feel like there has to be more to it, and the school knows that there's going to be more to it for them to kind of move as fast as they did, kind of letting him go. I think it's probably going to be over the next few months, more and more stuff coming out that's going to make it look really, really bad. And I think they kind of had no choice but to get ahead of it. And as much as, like you're saying, he kind of did take the program to a level that hadn't been at before, especially from, like you said, kind of the community and alumni base kind of being excited, and him being a guy that old college football alumni look at and they're like, that's a football coach. Like, that's the kind of guy I want coaching my football team. As much as that stuff is nice, other than really one season, they weren't winning that much.
No.
They won one game last season, and it was in a different country. They didn't win a college football game in America last year. And at the end of the day, it's like, if there's an article written that there's a culture of hazing at Alabama, is Nick Saban getting fired 5 days later? No, he's not. There would have to be pretty insane, like, this is what happened, I'm the guy that's telling you that this happened to me, for Nick Saban to get fired. So as much as people like to say that was super untouchable because of what he did for their program, at the end of the day, the way it works in sports in general, and really especially college sports, it's like winning is the name of the game. And as much as people can like you and be like whatever, it's like, you're expendable. The less you win, the more expendable you are. And like I said, he didn't win a college football game in the United States of America last season. And no matter what you think about, I mean, we don't need to even get into people that are so stupid on the internet that are like, so what, guys aren't allowed to bust balls anymore? Guys can't whip each other with towels in the locker room anymore? It's like, hey, I don't think that's what was going on. I don't think it was fun, playful banter between the fellas in the locker room. But aside from all of that, I think basically from a football perspective, they're going to be a mess this year. I think
they won't win a game this year. I think that's entirely reasonable, because from what I'm reading, they're going to go interim coach all season and try and find a replacement over the course of the year that's going to start when the season ends. So this is just a lame duck situation with a coach who's going to have to try and salvage a group that probably doesn't really want to play football.
No. And again, what we were saying about him is, despite the result on the field, people did seem to kind of be drawn to him because of his kind of personality. And I think he probably did get some recruits that he probably shouldn't have gotten just based on being Northwestern football that kind of wanted to play for him. And I think you could see guys kind of being like taking a year off, waiting to see what happens, going to transfer. Guys being like, if they pick up an injury in week 2, being like, I'm not coming back. Like, I'm not going to risk it. And I think it could go downhill pretty fast. I mean, the only thing I tweeted this, I mean, their win total, I don't know if it'll even come back up at this point before the season starts. And if it does, it's going to be like 1.5, 2.5. It's not going to be worth even getting involved in. But the one thing I did bet, after all this news came out, was UTEP over 5.5 wins, because UTEP plays Northwestern week 2. That was a game that in UTEP's win total, it was definitely kind of chalked up as a loss for them. And even now, they probably would still be underdogs in the game, just going on the road to a Big Ten team. But UTEP is a team I liked a lot. I think they can go there and beat them. Northwestern, their other out-of-conference game is Duke, which they'll probably lose. And then they do play Howard at home. So I think that they'll probably end the season with 1 win. I think they'll beat Howard. I think they're losing to Duke. They're losing to UTEP. They're losing every conference game. And they'll go 1-11 for the second year in a row. And then we'll see what they do next summer.
Yeah, that is – there have been some awful situations that people have come into where some genuinely atrocious shit has happened at these schools where football is kind of secondary. That is easily the most difficult of any of them in terms of football, because they have the academic restrictions. That's the biggest reason why you're never going to be able to win that many games there. It took a pandemic and a weird season where, Michigan played 6 games that year, where they were able to get to a Big Ten. Northwestern was able to get to a Big Ten title game. Hell, I say this all the time. Northwestern being in that Big Ten title game is the reason Justin Fields isn't a Jet right now, because Justin Fields looked atrocious in that first half, spooked everybody a little bit. The Jets took Zach Wilson. Fields went 3. That is the only reason Justin Fields isn't the Jets quarterback right now.
No, I 100% agree with you. And I guess I'll tell you in like a year from now whether I'm happy that we didn't get Justin Fields. If somehow things worked out, and not because of who we drafted, but because who we drafted was so bad, that referencing the other guy behind me, number 8 there, maybe things will work out. But so I kind of want to end on this. It's kind of the way you have to end every preview podcast, is just being completely put on the spot, making a prediction. Yeah. Who do you have winning the East? Who do you have winning the West? And then who do you have winning the championship game?
Ohio State and Wisconsin. Give me Ohio State to win the Big Ten again. It's been a few years. The new quarterback, McCord, you're always worried when a guy doesn't have a ton of experience, but if Ryan Day loses 3 years in a row, there's a real chance they stage a coup against him and he's out of there. So I think Ohio State kind of has to win the Big Ten this year. Penn State, I think, like we said when we were talking about them, I think they finished with 2 losses. I think Michigan will finish with 1 loss, and I think Michigan has a real shot to get in anyway.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you, but I don't want to do the same thing. So I'm going Wisconsin over Ohio State. I think Wisconsin is going to get better as the year goes on. I think after Ohio State beats Michigan, maybe they have a little bit of a letdown, especially if they're undefeated. They're going to be like, we're making the college football playoff. Even if we lose this game, Luke Fickell will get his guys up more than Ryan Day will. And so I'm taking Wisconsin. And just as a quick summary of the future bets I'm going to be making, I am going to bet Wisconsin plus 650 to win the Big Ten. I just made a prediction, so I have to do it. I'm going to be betting Penn State over 9.5 wins. I'm going to be betting Maryland over 7 wins, and I'm going to be betting Indiana under 3.5 wins. And that's my Big Ten futures.
I can't wait for football, Blake. I am itching.
I know, it's doing this just makes me even more excited than I have been. I'm going to be recording some more soon and very excited, but I appreciate you joining me. Big Ten, always one of the most fun conferences to talk about. Should be a really exciting conference this year with Penn State and Wisconsin, maybe closing the gap a bit on those top two teams. A lot of new quarterbacks, a lot of new coaches. Should be some good storylines throughout the year. And I'm sure we'll talk again during the football season, maybe before that Penn State Ohio State game again.
That sounds like a plan, sir.
All right. And do you just want to let people know where they can follow you and listen to you on other platforms?
So the Twitter handle's at Nick Zararis. I do a Rangers podcast. I do a Calgary Flames podcast. I edit the Gotham podcasts. I do a Substack. I do TikTok. I do too much content. I don't sleep. So if you see me on the timeline, shoot a follow. You'll learn something. I promise you that.
Yeah, one of the best Twitter follows, always has good content and everything, and we'll have great stuff during the football season. And yeah, if you're listening to this, Nick will be back at some point in the football season talking college football and NFL. And yeah, thanks for joining me.
Anytime, Blake. You know that.